So, welcome back, everyone. I should be doing the breakdance as well with that music, but I'll spare you that spectacle. Thank you very much. So, I hope you've eaten, refreshed, and your appetite has been whetted for more conversations and more deep dives into some of the issues that we discussed, very important issues that we discussed earlier this morning. This panel, and there are other panels taking place in other rooms on this venue, so I think you're at the right panel. This is about crisis and gender-based violence, one of the most important issues we talked about this morning. And the question we're asking is, how can we move from response to preparedness so that we don't always come up against the same problems, the structural problems, but also the tactical problems that come up sometimes when we're talking about gender-based violence in times of crisis. My name is Shada Islam, and I'm going to moderate this discussion. So we've seen from this morning, from the Gender Equality Index, that crises are on the rise and gender violence becomes even worse during times of crisis. Now that we know that, how do we take preventive action? And to discuss this further with me, we have the following people on the panel, but also someone coming in through a pre-recorded message. She is Reem Al-Salam. She's from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls. On stage here with me is my old friend and colleague, Ricardo de Borges Castro from the European Policy Center. He's Associate Director and Head of Europe in the World Program. Christina Fabre-Rossel, IGA Gender-Based Violence Researcher. Thank you. Noura Rad, European Network of Migrant Women, and Miguel Lorente, his former Spanish delegate on violence against women, forensic medicine as well, so a real doctor on stage as well. Thank you very much indeed, and we will have comments from the floor. Of course, I'll open to questions as well from all of you, but before I do that, online as well, welcome also to those watching us online. We'll have comments from Marceline Nodi. She's professor at the University of Malta, also at the European Observatory for Femicide, and an advisor and a member of Grevio, who drafted, of course, the Istanbul Convention, and you monitor, Marceline, its implementation. And also Laura Isabella Brunk. She's research fellow at the Institute for Political Science at the University of Duisburg and Institute for Development and Peace as well. So I'll ask you to comment after we've heard from our panelists. So let's have the video now from Reem Al-Salam, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls.
We live in a world where perpetual, multi-layered, complex crises is the new normal. In fact, we've been living in this world for a while now, even if the realization of this terrifying reality has only just started to sink in. A world in which day in, day out, we are living a triple mega crisis of conflict, climate change, and violence against women and girls, each of them of epic proportion, and each of them at some point and in principle preventable, and each of them having lacked the political will to do so. The unsurprising implication of this is, of course, that the safety, security, and quality of life for women and girls in today's world is and will continue to be much worse. Just to give you one example, today, at this point in time, and according to UN Women, it will take us 300 years to achieve gender equality at the rate we are moving. This is damning and alarming, yet unfortunately not alarming enough, because the world does not seem to be alarmed enough. There's no doubt that every crisis has a gendered impact, and that women and girls experience these crises different from men and boys. As I said in my report that I recently presented to the General Assembly of the UN, the climate crisis is exacerbating the risk of violence for women and girls in so many ways, whether it is increased risk to trafficking, early marriage, economic violence in the forms of reduced access to safe jobs or lands, and increased risk of domestic violence, depression, amongst so many other negative consequences. And while my report did not touch on the food crisis and its implications in detail, we know that this food crisis that is experienced so violently in many parts of the world is affecting women and girls more severely than men. It's also clear that when conflict breaks down, the minds, freedoms, agency, and bodies of women become almost the first frontier of this conflict and its first battleground. You do not need full-scale war for this to play out. Also, in countries where democracy, respect for rights comes up and clashes with forces of repression and authoritarianism, we see the rights and freedoms of women and girls being the ones that are first chipped at away and also the first to be at risk. In fact, if you want to measure the progress or regression of the state of human rights in a society, look no further than the situation of women and girls in that society and the extent to which they enjoy greater or lesser freedoms and fundamental rights. Even when hate speech, attacks, or intimidations are carried out against a group because of its ethnic, racial, religious, political, gender identity, sexual orientation, or other parts of their identity, perpetrators of violence will almost always strike at women and girls first. And as the COVID-19 crisis has demonstrated, any crisis comes to magnify not only the pre-existing structural and long-standing discriminations at play, the marginalization and the violence experienced by groups and individuals, including women and girls, but it will also spotlight the limitations and problems with the pre-existing legislative framework in place to protect women and girls and other vulnerable and marginalized minorities or groups, as well as the pre-existing plans to prevent and respond to violence against them, including violence against women and girls. So many countries today still do not have national action plans to combat violence against women and children, including to prevent femicide or gender-related killings. Where they do, many of them do not have enough resources. They don't have clear implementation roadmaps or benchmarks, and also the coordination structures in place between the different actors, including line ministries, is not functioning properly. So today I will not dwell on telling you what needs to be done to address this, because I know you know, like the rest of the world knows, what needs to be done. The issue is not lack of knowledge. We all know, we've been told countless times by victims, by organizations representing victims, and the roadmap is clear. Let me just say that we will only be able to make a difference if there is political will to implement this roadmap and the courage to treat the epidemic of violence against women and girls for the emergency that it is. And since it is a large-scale emergency that holds an entire society hostage and prevents it from prospering, it requires an all-society approach. And since the structural discrimination experienced by women and girls permeates all aspects of our lives, it really requires the gender transformative approaches to be also mainstreamed in all aspects of our lives. Last but not least, and I cannot believe that we still have to talk about this and make this point, but women and girls and organizations representing them need to participate equally effectively in all conversations, processes, not just those that have the phrases gender equality or gender-based violence in their title, but with any process that affects their lives, be it at local, national, regional, or global level. Thank you very much.
So Reem Assalam telling us about what we need to do in the future on a global level, which is very important to bring in. Ricardo, you do strategic foresight, and what I wanted to ask you was, how can we prepare ourselves for this intensity of new crises and also unexpected new crises that sometimes we face? But before you do that, just tell us, all of us, what is strategic foresight? You have a crystal ball in your pocket that you're going to bring out now and start predicting the future?
Thank you for the question, Shada, and thank you all also thank you for the invitation to be here. No, I didn't bring the crystal ball, but it's really important, and thank you for the question, because sometimes there's this misperception that foresight is basically the silver lining and that we will be able sort of to foresee the future. And that's really not the purpose of it. So I think it's really important that people understand that the strategic foresight, the purpose is not to predict, but it's rather to try to anticipate, to try to prepare for whatever futures might be happening ahead of us. And this is also another idea that I think it's very important, also because it brings the possibility of agency, of human agency, of trying to change things, which is the idea of action, of shaping the future. So what foresight actually can help you in terms then on the types of interventions that we do, and maybe we'll speak a little bit more about this, more than just be a mechanism or a tool that you can utilize at societal level, at the government level, at the institutional level. It's to prepare and just maybe to try to anticipate what might be some of the crises is also a tool to shape the future. In a sense, is to allow us not just to be bystanders, but actually to be actors in that future. So I think there's that positive element that I wanted also to bring. But of course, I mean, there are limitations. We are going to continue being surprised by crisis. But I believe that by using or by mainstreaming more and more these activities, and that's why I was also very intrigued when I got this invitation to bring foresight into a discussion on gender violence, which, I mean, it's an issue that I care deeply about, but it's not something that I'm an expert on. So, and I'll end here. The role of a foresight person more is to help groups such as yourselves as sort of a little bit of a window cleaner. It's someone that is there to help you answer the questions about the future that you might have and how you can actually better prepare for that future.
So Ricardo, at the moment, of course, we're living through, I think European Policy Center has called a situation of perma-crisis. And just tell us what these perma-crises are at the moment that the European Union is facing, and that could, in a sense, distract us a little bit, because we said this morning, let's not lose the focus on gender equality.
Indeed, I mean, I think it's very important, and as I think many have said today, and also with all the elements that in my preparation that I understood, that there is a link between crisis, whatever nature they might be, and an increase in violence against women, against girls. But what I think when we came up with this term, I think let's say the objective here of myself and my colleagues when we coined this term of Europe in the age of permacrisis was really to convey the idea that if we were thinking, and we came out with this, let's say, with an article on this at the first anniversary of the pandemic, so in March 2021, we felt that the levels of uncertainty, the negative trends that we were observing, either in geopolitics, in the economy, in democracy, as it was just mentioned, how democracy to a certain extent is declining around the world. How, let's say, the combination of all this would really, create this environment of permacrisis, which is very demanding, which is very, in a sense, we also wanted to convey decision makers that this might be their operating environment for the foreseeable future. And as you said, Shada, I think there is a risk in policy making in general, is that you focus on the crisis of the moment. And you tend to forget many of the things that are still happening. But if we actually look at the present moment, we are at a moment where, there was let's say, I mean, the perma-crisis did not happen overnight. But I believe that there are here two twin disruptors, which is the pandemic and then now the war, that have actually really accelerated some of these processes. And I understand that you've already discussed some of this already today. What we are facing now is, let's say, a confluence of crises that come together, that are interlinked: an energy crisis, a cost of living crisis, a cost of doing business crisis, a food crisis, potentially, in a sense, then, of course, if we get into what many now anticipate, which is a recession, even stagflation, which is the worst combination, which is low growth or recession and high inflation, this is a very difficult problem to solve in societies. So I think what we should probably be anticipating is a difficult, some have been calling it our next winter of discontentment, but I think we might be actually going into this, and so we do need to prepare.
Thank you very much. Very somber words, but as we've said also, in times of crisis, women bear the brunt of the impact of the crisis. So, Christina, let me bring you into the discussion, because we've talked about this morning also the pandemic has had a big, big negative impact on women and has led to an increase in violence against women. So what are your thoughts on this? What are your findings?
Well, EIGE has been conducting some research, mainly focusing on the COVID-19 pandemic, and what we have seen is that there's no data, but the scarce data that we got is that the severity and also the prevalence of any form of violence against women increases in times of crisis. Just building upon what Ricardo was saying about that preparedness, no? What we have learned in our study is also that none of the member states had a strategy to combat intimate partner violence, mainly during emergency crisis. But I'm not sure if we have learned anything or how we can be better prepared, because as you were saying, we have different crises coming in together. But what I saw is that at the moment when we were in the lockdown, in the most restrictive measures, we had an urgency for data. We wanted to know what was happening, and we were building upon two indicators mainly. One was the use and demand, or the demand and use of services, and femicide cases, because they were the data that was more kind of available for us. No? We saw the spikes of the demand of services, like in some member states, like 40, 50, 60 even % of women reaching out to the helplines and other support services. And when we were trying to monitor the femicide cases, we saw that the cases were stable or even decreased. And what I see is that the urgency for data, I don't know if you have the same experience, but the urgency for data now, it's kind of vanished. We don't have this feeling that we need data, as we had this urgency when the lockdown measures were in place. Now it looks like everything is like, or the other crises are not touching upon us that so closely. And despite this not urgency of data, we are seeing an alarming spike of femicide cases in some countries, such as Austria. So what we have learned also is that there were none of the member states was prepared, but also there were no monitoring mechanisms in place. And this is what I think that EIGE tries to work a little bit on, no? That to build indicators, that to monitor the violence, but not only during crisis, but post-crisis. And I think that we shouldn't not lose sight of femicide as a continuum of violence. No, violence, it's pre-COVID, pre-pandemics, pre-crisis, during the crisis, and post-crisis. No? And I think that we need to build these indicators on violence against women to monitor the impacts of any crisis on violence against women. No? That what we are now doing, EIGE, is jointly with FRA, conducting a survey on violence against women that will complement the survey that Eurostat is undertaken with member states. And we hope that this will provide us with a better knowledge about the impacts of violence during the COVID-19 on violence against women and the different women's experience of violence depending on the group of women. No? Because as the UN Special Rapporteur was saying, we cannot talk about the intersections between violence and crisis without talking about the intersections with prevailing inequalities and vulnerabilities. No?
So these are structural problems that become more visible, but also more deeper and more fraught during times of crisis. Have we learned any lessons, do you think, from the pandemic moment?
We have learned the message that we need to be better prepared.
Are we getting better prepared?
Yeah. I think that we have learned a lot of messages. Actually, we have seen that member states had no strategy in place, and also that the way that all the measures that were taken were reactive measures, but also like not widespread. We were expecting, I think, almost all of us, that EU would react, and all EU member states will react more quickly. And we have seen it's only like ad hoc measures, like, but not building proper action plans, proper strategies. Only 11 member states had some sort of strategy or even only guidelines that to tackle intimate partner violence during COVID. Then we saw that the other measures that were taken by the member states were, for instance, like providing shelters or accommodation that because of the lack of shelters, no? And what we have learned is that despite that we saw at that moment that the availability of shelters it was scarce, that people or the governments were just providing private accommodation for the women and their children that were experiencing intimate partner violence. This has not translated into more specialized services. No, they are still thinking about this private accommodation,
ad hoc,
which is not sustainable. You know, it's like okay, but that emergency moment it's okay, but accommodation should be accompanied by specialized support services, psychological, emotional, legal aid. And so we saw that there were like some ad hoc measures taken, but which of the measures will continue, will be sustainable, will be in place? No,
will be in place for the next time around, unfortunately. Please do keep thinking, and if you have questions online, do send them to me, and I will put them also to our panelists. Noura, Rad, if I could come to you, and Christina has talked about intersectionality, and your work in the field is often with migrant women, refugee women, and of course, they face enormous challenges and face risks when they are on their journey to come to Europe or anywhere else they are heading. So give us a little bit of your thoughts on what's needed now to be better prepared and to help these women in their everyday difficulties.
Thank you, Shada. So I will first start by maybe exposing quickly a few of risks and challenges that migrant women and girls face in their country of origin, their journey of exile, and arriving to Europe, borders, and EU countries. And after that, in the pandemic, and of course, how we can prepare more and how we can help and raise the rights for migrant women and girls. So we all know that when women decide to quit their home country, they do it because they are looking for a better life, to escape violence, generally male violence in their origin country, forced marriage, female genital mutilation, war and conflicts, pure system, and also in some countries they don't even have they are not allowed to continue their studies and to get diplomas and to build a career. So that's why women decide to take the journey of exile, hoping to find a better life in Europe. But unfortunately, we know that for most migrant women, in addition to what they suffer in their countries of origin, they face several inequalities, discrimination, and specific barriers to get the protection and to get even to their fundamental rights in Europe. For example, if we take the example of trafficking on women and girls, till today, 90% of victims of trafficking are women. Most of them are migrant girls and women. These women, they leave their countries with a dream to find a better life, a better job. After all violence and suffer in the way in their journey, they confront rituals like, for example, for African women, the juju ritual, violence, exploitation before arriving to Europe. They cross continents, and finally they find themselves, unfortunately, again in hands of traffickers, pimps, and perpetrators. Once they arrive, and they are exploited in prostitution and in surrogacy. The majority of these women ignore their language. These migrant women ignore their language. They ignore their rights, in fact, in EU countries. And they are completely isolated. If one day even one of them have this courage to go to the police and to denounce acts not even to denounce, for example, physical violence or rape or any kind of violence. They are stigmatized by authorities who only see them as migrant women, and they blame them for their migration and oftenly for their irregular situation. These women remain in the dark, and we have many examples of these women who are victims of femicide without knowing them, without knowing who they are, who killed them, and why they were killed. We find them just killed in the street, you know. They don't have any name. And they are completely marginalized and only used by men that often justify their acts by the fact that it's okay, they are migrant, and also we are helping them. And the problem that our systems are not designed, in fact, in a way to help these women to go, to denounce, to not feel like they are the authors or the perpetrators, but they are the victims, and that, yes, they have rights and they have the right to exit prostitution, to stop from all this violence. And that's why, from our perspective as European network of migrant women, we think that, in fact, we need to understand what women are being subjected in prostitution or sexual exploitation, also in surrogacy, so we can move on and protect these women. And this is exactly, in fact, what's happening on Ukrainian women since the start of the war against Ukraine. These women are fleeing war, but they find themselves exploited in surrogacy and in prostitution. Everyone was thinking that the prostitution and surrogacy will stop with the war, but no. We have more victims of surrogacy, more victims of sexual exploitation, because traffickers are profiting from the vulnerability of these women. And so legal system in EU should change by taking women's rights and the protection of these women as a priority. And we should stop, in fact, giving traffickers, perpetrators, and pimps the right and the opportunity to exploit and abuse girls and women. And that's why we think today that abolitionist system is the best way, in fact, to start protecting women and to move on combating violence against women. This is the first example for migrant women facing risk in their country and also arriving to Europe. But we have also women, in fact, who flee their countries to flee the war. You know, we can talk about Afghan women, we can talk about Syrian women also, and of course Ukrainian women. And these women, once they are in Europe, they are facing domestic violence, you know, in their families, and they are also confronted directly to an asylum system that, I should say it, an asylum system that is made by man and for man. I am a lawyer, I work in asylum, and I see every day, we are struggling every day as lawyers, as feminist lawyers, but also as women, just to say that violence, forced marriage, genital mutilation, also sexual violence, are violence, and women deserve to have a protection, this refugee status, and not the temporary protection. And judges don't understand us. And just that. Thank you. And in fact, we are in front of judges that doesn't even care. You know, all their interest, why you are here? Are you learning French? Do you have kids? How many years have you been here? And when these women arrive with their family, so when they arrive with their husband, it's another story again. Why? Because in the judicial system, but also from service providers, they give all the attention to man. So we are still living in 2022 in EU countries, in societies that give men the priority because they are considered as the breadwinner, yeah? And so man is one who should go to take courses, language courses. Men had the priority to do trainings and to look for a job, and for her, it's okay, she has to stay at home and take care of her children. And in front of judges, if the judge, in fact, look at her, the only question that, and I'm serious, we face this every day, the only question that the judge would ask her, Madam, are you having the same fears as your husband in your country of origin? because, you know, she doesn't have a life, she doesn't have another fears, or she's not subjected to violence. But also from service providers. Service providers, when often these women are victims of domestic violence and they are in all this procedure of asylum or other procedure to get regularized in EU countries, they tell them, you cannot, you have, to shut your mouth, and you cannot say that you are victim of violence because your husband will be expelled to the country of origin, so you have to keep calm, to take your papers because you are related to him, and then you can do wherever you want. So we are not helping these women to move on and to denounce this violence.
Right.
I don't know if I still have a little bit of time, but I really want also to talk about women who arrive, because it's really a big problem in EU countries. Even if we have legislation, we are trying to work on laws, but we have a problem for women who arrive by forced marriage that we call family reunification, and most of them, they arrive by forced marriage, in fact, because they come, their parents send them to marry a cousin or someone from the village. You know, you will have the best life in Europe, you have to be silent, you have to be a good girl. So these women arrive on family reunification, and these women, they are in fact administratively linked directly to their husband. This is the problem in our laws. So he manages everything, she stays at home, she doesn't know the language, she doesn't know anyone, and more, she's in fact assaulted, she's arrested, she's raped by her husband, who feel like he is superior and he's the hero. He brought her from the third country. And in fact, in this case, even if she's victim of violence, she cannot go and denounce. You know, she never left this house. She doesn't know the language. She doesn't know her fundamental rights. And which is bad, I think, what we should work on is the interpretation and the application of law in EU countries, not the law, because we have laws who protect
these women
victims of violence. But man who feels strong, he will go, he will denounce her to the administration, and she will lose her residency card, and she will go back to the country of origin. And when we say going back, return to the country of origin, that means violence from her parents and exclusion from the society, because she's considered as she is, you know, she damaged the family and she shamed the man honor. So
thank you, Noura. Thank you for that very powerful testimony. I'm not cutting you short. I will come back to some of these issues, but I do need to turn to Miguel to keep the time. But thank you very much for the very different stages at which migrant women, refugee women face violence at home, but also in their relationship with their traffickers and with the services that they need to access. So a lot of work has to be done, and it's organizations like yours that has taken on this charge of doing this responsibility. Thank you very much, Noura. Miguel, let me turn to you as well, because sorry, I've got this noise here. You've been working on national responses, right, in crisis situations, firsthand, violence against women. And I was just wondering, in our previous conversations, you've talked about the structural problems. The crisis just doesn't happen. Something has led to that crisis, and that we need to act before things get really bad and violence starts taking place. Elaborate a tiny little bit, please.
Thank you, Rasha, and thank you, Aige, for the invitation. And of course, the crisis is not an accident. It's a result of something that we are doing or that we are not doing in an androcentric way to understand reality and to manage this reality. So when we have a structural problem like inequality and like gender-based violence, what we see in crisis time is that they doesn't create new circumstances for gender-based violence. What's happening in a crisis situation is that the normal and existing circumstances are enhanced by the crisis. So what's happened is that in these circumstances, gender-based violence against women increase because the circumstances, the normal circumstances like isolation, like control, like difficulties to attend the institutions, the different priorities in the response, everything changed, but are normally, because they are existing. So if we want to prepare the response to deal with gender-based violence in a crisis, we have to start before the crisis. Because during a crisis, we are not going to solve anything but the own result the crisis provoke because the situation.
So you have to get rid of patriarchy, basically.
Yeah, in some way is, for example, I think about that. It's a kind of reflection. If we are not able to tackle gender-based violence in time of peace and normality, how we are going to be able to tackle and solve gender-based violence in time of crisis? So it's not possible. We are living with gender-based violence. We have a period of time during the pandemic where gender-based violence has increased, and we don't have any data in the European Union about that. So how is possible it? So it means that the structurality of these elements, as Marceline mentioned this morning, is too deep, and there is no will to change these circumstances. Because, for example, we are living in a crisis time, economical crisis time. EIGE have done a study that tell us that gender-based violence costs to the European Union 300,000 millions of euros every year. Are anybody talking about how to cut the cost of gender-based violence just to save some money to solve other social problems? Are we investing in preventing violence just to solve an economical problem in time of crisis? No. And another question, I think that our model has failed. We have a model based on the police and judicial approach, and it's not working. It's not working, and it's not going to work. In Spain, after 18 years of specific law, integral law against gender-based violence with many resources, with many information, with many specialization, we just get a 25% of reported cases. So after all this effort, because this is not the solution, this can be part of the solution. We have to move from a police and judicial model to a health and social model, because what women need is what we can help them to solve their circumstances, not what we think that they need.
Is it changing? Are governments doing what you're saying?
They are starting to understand that the health consequences of gender-based violence are one of the most important circumstances and situations. And we know that, for example, we have 25% of women in police and judicial institutions, but we have 100% of women who suffer violence in health and social institutions. So we can detect them, we can act with them, we can listen their words and their silence, and we can solve the situation. Because what we cannot do is to occupy their silence with our words to make them sense in our androcentric world. So we need to change all these things previous to a crisis, and this way we will diminish gender-based violence in our society, and when the circumstances in a crisis enhance the element, gender-based violence is not going to be so high, and this way we can be more effective in the way to act with gender-based violence.
So real preventive action, improving the structural issues dealing with gender equality, basically.
Yeah.
Giving women the rights, not just because of crisis coming, but really as part of societal change, societal development.
Yeah, but we have to pass to action. It's not enough to say that we have to promote gender equality.
No, we do it.
We do it in specific policies, like, for example, to implement a social and health approach for gender-based violence, not only police and judicial one. And of course that there are many things to do, but we have to pass from the words to the actions.
Thank you very much, Miguel. Thank you also for explaining it. So I'll just do a very quick second round and then go to our commentators. So Ricardo, in the strategic foresight field, the gender perspective, you said it may not be there now, but you think it's something worth bringing in?
I mean, I think one of the things that, strategic foresight has become a much bigger thing in the past few years. And there's, of course, I mean, there's issues to it. It has been traditionally a very elitist type of sport, if I can put it that way, because it's done in universities, in governments, in companies. So now it's starting to trickle down to society. And so there's a strong school of participatory foresight, which is basically the engagement of the communities that are affected by any given problem that you can bring them in. And I think, of course, I mean, if you actually need to address the issues as we are discussing, and I think there's a couple of points. Can I pick up on some of the points that were referred? I mean,
Absolutely.
I think but let me first answer your question. I think to solve some of these issues through, let's say, a foresight intervention, I mean, it's a no-brainer. You need to have these women in the room. They need to be there because, of course, I mean, the experts might know what systemically how this should look like. Because what I've heard, from all is that whatever we have now doesn't work. The systems, even from the systemic standpoint,
the system fails women.
Yeah. So what we need to do is to reinvent let's say, systemically, we need to reinvent. Yeah.
Go back. Yeah, go on.
I think,
No.
but I think I have a microphone. Thank you. So, can you? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think you would need to, in a sense, the tools that you would utilize in a situation such as this is what we call in foresight the visioning and the backcasting, meaning that you reach a conclusion that whatever you have, it doesn't work. So you're going to imagine how would the system be a perfect system, either be it for refugees or for the health issues that you're just alluding to. And then what you do, sort of, you imagine what would be the ideal situation. So this is in the normative future field, where you either imagine the future that you would want to have, or you actually imagine the future that you don't want to have, but I guess we are already in that future. We are in the future that we don't want to have in the way that women are treated across the board in all of the issues that you mentioned. And then you think through, once you sort of reach your, let's say, and this is again, I mean, foresight is a team sport, and where you have the correct people around the room, and in this case, women, refugee women probably that have been, victims of violence, but also you need to have men as well. I mean, men need to be part of this conversation, and I think it's important that, while thinking about this ideal future, then normally what we do is that you depart from the future and you try to see what would be the policy decisions, the changes that you would need to make until you arrive to the present time. And the reason you do that, let me just finish on this point, is that if you start from the present, you're going to find all the obstacles not to change. You're going to say, oh, this is impossible, this is impossible, this is impossible. Whereas if you come from the future, you create what you want, and you just walk back, and you see at each point what needs to happen for you to have that change or to avoid that world, as I was saying. Two final points that I want, or a final point that I want to make that is very important that was said as well. Data. There are no facts about the future. So you need always to have data, and good data. And I understand that there are some problems in collecting data in cases like this, but without having even then longitudinal data that you can actually also see what has been the evolution of the problem, it is also very difficult then to address this problem. So I think the collection of data, this would be something that I would insist. Lessons learned, data collection, data collection, data collection. Be out there in that, all organizations contributing to a system like this, because by this you can actually understand, in a sense, not only think where or anticipate where things might be going, but where you need to make changes.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Christina, any comments before I turn to questions?
No, just what Ricardo was saying, that we need to envisage which should be that our ideal. I don't think that we can reach it out. I think I think that we need to really think what preparedness means. And for me, taking into account how is the society now, and that the only thing that we can just really be sure is that the wave of refugee women, migrant women will increase, the insecurity, economical well-being insecurity will increase, which will lead also to more intimate partner violence. I think that for me, preparedness is to be sure that we will provide meaningful protection. So just to be, like analyze what we can provide. And rather than thinking about prevention, that of course we need to work in parallel with prevention, but also like think preparedness as a meaningful protection.
Thank you very much. You want to? Yes, you can. This is a conversation.
Just one issue that you just mentioned, refugees, and I think we might have another wave of refugees coming from Ukraine in the next few weeks if the attacks continue on the energy, infrastructure, if kids can't go to school, and what is happening, and you will continue having from other parts of the world. But when we look at Europe, I would start paying attention to this, which energy poverty. In 2020, there were 35 million Europeans that could not get their houses properly heated. I think if if we do have an energy problem and crisis in Europe in the next few weeks and months, I think this issue of energy poverty is likely to increase. And again, if we take it that from crisis, there will be gender violence and violence against women, I think we need to look into this as well, as a preparedness sort of mechanism.
To be proactive in actually preventing that. Thank you very much indeed. I'll come back to the two of you after we've had questions and comments. So if I could ask you, Professor Marceline Nodi, I think your role in the Istanbul Convention, I think, is something really worth noticing, because I wanted to ask you the role that the IC can play in combating gender-based violence in times of crisis. If you like, you can come up here and speak from here. Or you'll have to stand up in any case, so please. Yeah, you're right. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Are they? Yes, now you're done. Okay. As I was listening to you all speak, there were so many things I wanted to say. As you were speaking, I would say, yes, and, yes, but, yes, and.
Now's your chance.
So definitely, the Istanbul Convention, when we're talking about strategic foresight, when we're talking about where do we want to get to and how can we get there, and let's work backward. Hey, we have that. We have it. It's the Istanbul Convention. It's the Istanbul Convention that has, that includes the issue of migrants. And in fact, sadly, some of the articles that countries can make reservations on, that is to say, they say we won't do this one, relates to some of the things that you said, so that's very sad. But we have that. We have that. So we have the Istanbul Convention, which is a step-by-step, if you like, guidelines, whatever, to get us to where we want to get. When we had the COVID pandemic, I spoke at various events, and we're saying, if Europe, if the European countries, European member states, and others had the Istanbul Convention implemented, not just signed, obviously, implemented in their countries prior to the COVID pandemic hitting, hey, we wouldn't have had that increase that, in fact, we had. So whenever you might say, well, of course, she's going to talk about the Istanbul Convention. Let's tell you, hey, I was there. I was part of the drafting committee. During the drafting, there were many frustrations. There were many times when I thought, oh, we couldn't get that through. But at the end of the day, we had a legally binding convention for the prevention and combating of violence against women. And it has been referred to as the gold standard, and somebody mentioned that this morning. I was very pleased to hear. It is the gold standard on combating and preventing violence against women and domestic violence. And I really think that we need to get that ratified by the EU.
Thank you.
That it is a stronger thing than the actual directive that they are talking about.
Thank you, Marceline.
Can I just make another couple of points? The other thing I would like to say is that so often our focus is on what the women can do, what society needs to do. I think we also need to turn our focus a bit on why is it that there are so many men who think they are allowed to, it is acceptable to control, to abuse, and to kill women and children. regardless of normal or crisis times, both in normal and in crisis times. And in the COVID, when there was the COVID pandemic, when there was the lockdown, rather, there was a spotlight shone on specifically intimate partner violence, because people are saying, you know, there are these women who are locked in with their perpetrators, etc., which was, of course, very true. Sadly, we are not seeing that now with the Ukraine crisis, with the conflict in Ukraine. So, because there is a conflict in Ukraine, there are women who are sexually violated and killed as part of the part, as part of the course of a conflict, and we are not shining a light on that, and we need to shine a light on that as well. And just one last thing. Promise?
All right. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Fine, Marceline.
Okay.
I am running short of time, though.
Okay. So being better prepared, if countries implement, I'll tell you again, implement, not just sign and ratify, implement, that is good for pre-crisis, during crisis, and post-crisis. And for women to report violence, for women to leave an abusive relationship, they need to be assured that they will find the help and the support that they need, which means accessible, sufficient specialist services, as well as general services, knowledgeable and empathic police officers and other helping professionals, courts that understand the gendered nature of violence and don't reply in the way that you pointed out, Noura. So courts that understand the gendered nature of violence against women and that gives them justice, including in custody decisions. At the moment, there is a whole, again, there is a rising shadow cloud above custody decisions in cases of domestic violence. We know that this is difficult to achieve even in so-called normal times. It is more difficult in times of crisis. But if we have things in place to assure them before, during, then they should also be there in the post and in the post-crisis. I thank you, and I thank you for allowing me a bit more than my 2 minutes.
Thank you, Marceline. Laura. 2 minutes, Laura. I need to, no, not at all. I'll take questions also from the floor. Not at all. It's not an age thing. Please.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to stay on the topic of justice as well. Thank you for that, Marceline, for making the transition easy here. In times of peace, a woman who is raped before she's murdered will be considered a femicide victim. The same goes for female victims of human trafficking or those who are killed because they break dominant gender norms. In situations of war and conflict, however, we do not yet apply the same logic. I've heard it here a bit in this debate, but it's not normal to acknowledge these as femicides. Many murders, however, committed during war are in fact femicides. They just stay invisible. So my first step forward would be to acknowledge them as what they are, retrospectively in conflicts and wars of the past, and also very much call them out in ongoing wars. This then brings me to a second part, which is what happens with post-conflict societies if we don't do this. And this links nicely to prevention as well, because prevention is not just in the beginning of a crisis or before one even happens, it's also in the aftermath of a conflict. So beyond this conceptual element of naming femicides as such, as what they are, there's a practical implication if we do not identify them correctly in situations of conflict. In post-conflict societies, we use transitional justice mechanisms nowadays as a standard procedure to deal with the past of violent conflict. What transitional justice fails to do is that after decades, it still pays insufficient attention to gendered experiences of violence, unfortunately. Violence against women continues to be trivialized in comparison to other crimes. It's lumped together as general murder. Yeah? If at all, what we've seen in the last 20 years or so, very much on the UN agenda, is that rape committed against survivors is slowly moving up as a topic. But there's very little integration in peace treaties if you actually look into them in detail, and there are very few convictions of war crimes of this nature. So on the individual level then, the problem is that femicide victims are denied the full experience of justice which they deserve. And on a society level, the issue is much, much larger. And this brings me into this debate that you guys are having here. what happens is that it allows for the creation of cultures of violence to transition from a conflict into the new post-conflict era, which normally is a chance, it's an opportunity to redefine the future. And here, this violence from the past, these cultures of violence, they mix with other violence-favoring conditions, such as the availability of weapons, drug abuse, trauma, frustration. All these factors come together, and this is basically where it explodes. We have evidence of extremely high femicide rates in countries with a recent history of violent conflict. Forms of violence here also strongly resemble those of the violence experienced in armed conflict. And this brings me to the fundamental question for all of us here. Whose peace are we really promoting in post-conflict peace building? And if we think about this question a little bit further, we also move more towards prevention and actual steps for action. So that's my contribution to
Thank
today.
you. Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you very much. I'd like to take some questions from the floor. I see 2 hands, 3 hands, 4. So very quick, please, questions, so I can go back to the panel for responses. So yes, please, but in the second row first row, 4.
I'm Iluta Lāce from Latvia, Marta Centers. This is an organization that on daily basis support victims of gender-based violence, those that have suffered from intimate partner violence, also pornography, prostitution, other forms of trafficking. And we have gone through a pandemic crisis where almost our women that seek for help, it was like almost 50% more than before. And then we had the pandemic was not ended, and then we had like full-scale invasion of Russia and Ukraine, and we had many women coming to Latvia with children, and we also were eager to support them not to become victims of trafficking or some kind of other violence. So we have one crisis and another crisis. But what I want to stress here, when I'm picking up this microphone, is that what we have seen from our practice working with victims, that if we do have laws and if we do have policies that really define things in proper way and really make these things functioning, we see that it works. For example, in 2014...
I'm sorry, I really will have to ask you to wind up now because there's several other people asking questions.
Yeah, this is what I want to say, that really laws, if they define violence against women as a crime, they work. And Istanbul Convention, that I would like to say it's a minimum standard to combat violence against women. It's one great tool, but another thing that we need to do in Europe, and this is a call from feminists also and female activists in Ukraine, is we need to have clear laws and policies to finally punish sex buyers and do something about surrogacy.
Thank you. Thank you. Could you just take the microphone could you just give it to the lady here? I really would urge you to, it's respect, because I need to go back to the panel and also give time to other commentators. Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you for this very important discussion. I'm just thinking about the COVID crisis and how it thrust us online at an unprecedented rate, and how this aggravated the already existing digital divide, where we know that women have less digital access than men, are less likely also to work jobs that can be easily adapted to the internet. Now, cyber violence also increased drastically during the pandemic, with revenge porn helplines experiencing up to a 700% increase, and Zoom bombings became a serious issue as well. And also, in war zone areas and crisis areas, traffickers are using the internet to buy and sell women and girls. Right. Not to mention the fact that totalitarian regimes frequently shut down the internet to squash protests, as we're seeing in Iran now, following the murder of Mahsa Amini, which is a protest led by women and girls, some of whom are literally being killed for their beliefs in the current uprising.
Right.
So my question is,
please,
what role do you see the internet playing in crisis preparedness, and what is the significance of a digital crisis response in your mind?
Okay, thank you. I was going to take 2 more questions, but I'm sorry, I just don't have the time. I have to go back to the panel, and if we have time, I'll take it. There's also a question online, which is addressed to you, Noura, which is about organizations such as the European Network of Migrant Women, being part of the national consultation process in preparation of national recovery and resilient plans across the EU. Very, very important question as well. So let me go to you, Miguel, first. If you could respond to some of the, let's say, concerns that have been expressed, what has been said before by the panelists, and then finally, also, your 3 steps forward on gender equality.
Okay. First, the answer and then the steps, yeah?
Okay.
Well, I think that when you talk about clear policies, of course, but the way that we apply the policies is the key, because we apply from an androcentric consideration or perception of reality. So that's what some of the problem that Nora mentioned when a judge makes some assumptions about women and they don't do about men. So I think that, of course, we need these clear policies. We need training and specialization for professionals. And I would say that we should select very well which are the context or the fields where we want to act to change reality, because the police and judicial frame that is necessary, of course. I'm not talking about the substitutions. I am talking about the complementation from the health and social frame, because these are the places where women are and where women have confidence on the institutions, on the solutions. Because many women don't want, as a first decision, that their partner go to jail, for example. But they want to receive attention and assistance to their problems. And when we put first the police and judicial questions, they don't want to go to the institution because they don't want this kind of answer. So, like a student in Granada, Elisa Ronconi, in his PhD, he mentioned that we cannot take their silence and occupy it with our words, because we are getting a mistake. And I think that is one of the key, to select very well the field where we want to contact with women and to try to train and specialize the institution to make the attention from a feminist perspective, not from an androcentric perspective. And internet is the key. It's the key now because it's a continuity of violence. There is no stop. You can violence a woman during all time. You can control her all the time through internet, and then you can use the real word to commit the aggressions or to commit the femicide. And we have to learn how to change this instrument in hands of the perpetrators to use as educational instrument and try to promote many critical perspective to not accept this kind of misogynic message, but at the same time to try to transmit a positive message for equality and to change the normal circumstances. I think that is something that we have to learn. It's not easy, but it's something that we have to do.
Right, and your 3 quick steps.
Well, I didn't think very much about that, but I will say that the first one could be detection. We cannot take invisibility as non-existing situation, and now many people think that what we don't see doesn't exist.
Happen. Mm-hmm.
So I think that would be the first one. The second one would be extension. We have to take this knowledge and conscience and awareness and share with all society to make society responsible of their position.
Right.
And the third one would be in this line, implication, in terms that it's not enough what many people say in Spain, many men. They say, I am not a batterer, I am not machista, and they live in a theoretical neutrality, and it's not true. If you not do something to change reality with gender-based violence, discrimination, and all the consequences of inequality, you are doing from your passivity to continue this situation.
You're responsible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Noura, so if you could answer the question that I put to you, and you'll have to be quite short because I have to go back to Ricardo and Christina, and your 3 points going forward.
Okay, thank you, Shada. In fact, quickly, I just want to say that, women are struggling, women generally are struggling every day to get to access to the justice, to their fundamental rights. Migrant women, girls and women more. In this COVID pandemic, we saw that it has amplified existing discrimination and violence. Women, and especially migrant women, were between, we leave home where there is violence and we stay in the street, or we go back, we risk our life, or we stay in the street and we risk also to be exploited by traffickers and pimps and perpetrators. So as a network, in fact, we saw that this COVID pandemic and more generally all crises, war and all crises, show us that the failure of the legislative European system, but also sometimes the interpretation and the bad application of this system to effectively guarantee the access to rights for migrant women and girls. And for us, in fact, in this pandemic, we tried to do our best to continue working, to continue hearing the voice of these women. We had meetings between us to put solution in new countries, to put safely these women. But after the pandemic, also we had lessons, and we worked on 2 reports. The first report is the one on fundamental rights for undocumented women, and it's also, there's a big part on the pandemic and the consequences on these women. It's published on our website. And the second one, and it's the first time, it's a report on surrogacy and migrant women. And this is really the first report on the subject, and it's also online.
Your 3 steps forward, please, Noura.
For the 2 steps forward, well...
3.
Okay, 3, sorry. I have the right for 3.
Okay.
So, for us, again, from our perspective, I think we should go from experience, from women experience. We have to understand the origin of violence and the consequences of this violence on women, and also the patriarchal system.
Right.
To combat violence and to achieve equality, we need, in fact, to understand this.
Okay, number 2.
Number 2 is to harmonize all policies and legislation in Europe,
right?
So we can really combat effectively sexual and violence exploitation.
Number 3.
And number 3 is to understand the needs, in fact, of migrant women and girls. So we need professionals that are feminist. We need structures that are adapted to their situation, and also to take into consideration their mental health.
Thank you very much. 3 very important points going forward. Ricardo.
My 3 points.
Yes, in your strategic foresight.
I would have more, but I'll stick
we
to
don't
3,
have time.
Unfortunately,
but conversation continues, right?
I mean, learn the lessons. Learn lessons from previous crises. If we're talking about crisis and what they, in what they result in terms of violence against women. So first, learn lessons, collect data. I think data collection is fundamental here, so that we can intervene in the areas that, I understood it's systemic, but maybe there are some areas here and there that you can do. And then it was a little bit your question, bring the gender perspective into this. You need to have women in this conversation. You need to have men, but you need to have women in this conversation. This is...
And there aren't any at the moment?
There actually, and this is the good news. Most of the foresighters, or let's say the thought leaders in foresight, they're mostly women.
Oh, okay.
They're mostly women. I'm sort of an outlier.
Okay.
I'm not a thought leader in any sense of the word, but I'm an outlier in the foresight.
So there are women there, but they're not looking from the gender perspective. That's quite
I think some will do, and look also from a developmental perspective. Right. I think that's also important, but it is, of course, we need to do more.
Okay. So lesson learned. Christina.
Yes, thank you. I would like to go back to the conflict, and not to crisis, but to conflict. And I want to mention a research that was conducted analyzing 1,188 peace agreements. And we found that, or they found, the researchers found that only 19% had a reference on women's rights, and 5% tackled sexual violence in conflict in these peace agreements. So I do think that in the post-conflict, there is a lack of attention of the conflict-related violence against women, sexual violence against women, by all actors. Violence becomes normalized, and victims feel ostracism, feels blame, feels a stigma, So there are the former combatants that we don't sometimes take them into account, no? May also have normalized violence. They don't know how to deal with the trauma. Perpetrators are not held accountable, and women, the victims, don't receive any response. So my 3 steps forward are not 3 steps forward. My 3 steps forward will be just a call for actions for the EU and also EU member states, that we are supporting Ukraine a lot now in this in the war. I would like also to see all this commitment from starting from the institution I am representing now here, no, that to work together with the Ukrainian in what hopefully will be soon the starting the state building, no, the peace building. So I'm not sure if Victoria, a very young Ukrainian lawyer, is here today. She should be, but perhaps she's attending another session. But I know that there are other Ukrainians that are attending the session online. So I would really like to help and to work together to build or to rebuild the state, addressing women's rights, sexual and reproductive rights, and violence against women, and include these as a key components for providing peace to the new country, no, that it's to be rebuilt. And I know that it will entail a huge effort, that we need to have specific provisions to tackle violence against women in the home and in the community by returning combatants. We need to increase mechanisms and programs to provide psychological support, as Nora was mentioning, and the reintegration of women. No? We also, Nora was saying that returnees, refugees, and migrant women are the ones that are suffering the most prevalent violence. So we need to work for the reintegration of the women that have suffered the most. No? And we need to take into account the stigma, how we are going to tackle stigma for the ones that will return to the country, and also to remove the barriers from them to really seek for justice. So mainly what I would like is just to say that here there's a huge community of feminists, of academics that with a lot of expertise. And I would like that from the Ukrainians that are attending today online, that to reach out to us, to work together, to rebuild the country in a peaceful way. That means that we need to take into account women's rights and to tackle violence against women during inside let's say, of this security agenda.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, which brings me to the end of this session, a very important session. I apologize to those who could not put up their hand and have a question. We now have to disperse, and in 15 minutes, other sessions will start. But the conversation continues, so these questions that you could not ask here today and now will come up, and please do raise your hand again with other speakers, other panel sessions, so those questions can be discussed. So thank you very much to Ricardo, Cristina, Miguel, and Nura. Thank you to all of you, and have a happy afternoon, and let's meet here again and in other sessions as well. Thank you.